Hi, I'm Cardiff Garcia, and this is The New Bazaar. Coming up on today's show.
It's a joke that it's been more like Schoolhouse Rock than like House of Cards. Just people were like, let's get to yes.
Alex Armlovich on how the road to housing is paved with good intentions, sure, but also shockingly great ideas. Hey everyone, Cardiff here. That intro you heard just now was actually a little pun on something that's happened recently. There is a bipartisan bill making its way through Congress right now called the Road to Housing Act, where ROAD is an acronym that stands for Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream. And it is a remarkable bill. It's remarkable for a whole bunch of reasons, and I think things are so crazy elsewhere in the news or in the world that I don't think the bill has gotten the attention that it deserves. If it becomes law someday, there's a chance that it'll go a long way towards solving one of the most trenchant problems in American life, the housing crisis, the lack of housing availability and affordability. And I myself would not have known about it, except that today's guest, Alex Armlovich, the senior housing analyst at the Niskanen Center, and his colleagues have convinced me that it is remarkable. Alex is not just one of my favorite observers of the housing market and of economic trends. He's also somebody who brings a scrutinizing and a skeptical eye to policies generally. So if he likes this policy, it is doing a lot right. So Alex joins me now in the studio, and we're going to talk about different approaches to housing policies, the kind of strange and shifting alliances that support certain policies. And we go into detail on what's in this bill itself, because it not only reflects a lot of good ideas, it also reveals so much of what went wrong and led to the housing problem in the first place. Then at the end, since Alex and I have both lived in New York City for a while, we're also going to have a short segment where each of us offers our reflections on housing and construction and just the nature of change in our city. Alex, welcome to the New Bazaar. How are you, man?
Great. Yeah. Excited to be here.
So you heard me set up the chat just now. You and I have talked about this before, about how when people talk about the housing problem and they say there's not enough housing in the U.S., they're leaving out something that's kind of big and important. Can you share that with our listeners to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So the original idea of a housing shortage, it kind of started in high wage, high productivity coastal cities and has been spreading. But even as it has involved more and more metro areas getting caught up into this problem of prices above what actually costs to build a new structure.
By the way, you're talking about New York, San Francisco, big.
It used to be like 7
places.
Cities.
Right.
Yeah. It used to be 7 cities, and now it's a lot more than 7. Economists use this fancy term. They call it spatial misallocation. And you don't have to worry about that. It just means what it is that there's not enough houses near where people want to live, as symbolized by their choices in the marketplace, by their renting and buying behavior. So that means houses near opportunity, near high wages, near good infrastructure, and in good weather. Is the other
good jobs,
exactly.
Good amenities.
Good jobs, good amenities, and good weather. That is where there is a strong shortfall of housing. It's not a placeless problem. If it was simply a matter of needing a roof to protect you from the rain and walls to protect you from the wind, there are enough physical structures to provide that shelter. It's that they are in places that don't have that mix of things that people are trying to move to. So if you just needed a roof over your head, there are places in left behind cities and in rural areas, there's unincorporated rural areas in this country that don't even have zoning codes.
You could build as much as you wanted there.
Exactly. If you go 80 miles out from an urban core, far from churches, jobs, family, friends, infrastructure, anything other than agriculture, yeah, you can absolutely get shelter over your head there. And so it's a shortfall of access to the places where people are trying to move to. And then that has knock-on consequences for overcrowding in those areas, homelessness in those areas when your management of your daily life gets pushed you beyond the economic brink. And so in that sense, we like to simplify for messaging purposes the idea of a national shortage because there's a way to conceptualize that. But when people ask me, well, Alex, I want to provide housing subsidies to get housing built. How do I get 3 million units built tomorrow or, built now? And I go, well, 3 million units where? So Congress could appropriate funds to build 3 million houses in the woods in random places.
Middle of the Nevada desert or something.
Exactly.
Sure.
You could go out to federal land in the desert and be like, okay, I mean, here's, and just give away houses there. But you'd be asking people to move away from the places that they're trying to move with their family, friends, jobs, churches. Everything we do in life is about connecting to and collaborating with other people. There are vast open spaces, in the country where you could build, but what makes a place desirable to live is the presence of other people.
Yeah, and certain other things that also make that place desirable. Yeah, that's interesting because when we talk about a national housing shortage of X number of units, that really is way too simple. It's not like this problem is consistent across all geographies. It is located in certain places.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to start also by talking about the shifting coalitions that I just mentioned there at the top, the sort of divide between people who want more housing to be built and to be more easily built in certain places versus, I think, others who think, number one, that the housing shortage is not necessarily connected to the housing affordability problem, and number two, the people who think that local residents also should have a big say in whether or not new construction can happen in their areas. So this is the so-called YIMBY, yes in my backyard, versus NIMBY, not in my backyard divide. It's kind of interesting how this has developed over the years because it's not really a left-right problem. It's not really something that breaks down along easily defined ideological categories. How do you see the evolution of this divide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as the problem has spread, like it began with an elite consensus. It was kind of like it began in kind of urban economics journals. And then there were some coastal grassroots groups forming in the 2010s. A little before that, it was reaching the think tank space. Like I, came to a New York City think tank in 2013. I was like Glazer pilled. I wanted to go be an intern where he was a senior fellow.
A guy named Ed Glazer, a famous economist, who covers housing. You're talking, by the way, right now about the YIMBY movement, the people who want more housing to be built, right?
That began to build and spread, and as the price above production cost problem has spread to more places, it's no longer just, New York, Boston, SF. It's like, and then it was 7 cities, and now it's dozens of metropolitan areas. Even Dallas is starting to see prices get a little bit higher than they should be. And so, I think that has been a forcing mechanism, like open minds, in addition to the idea that at some level, the idea that having more houses is necessary to have more houses is not that unintuitive. There's a certain circularity to it. Surely the number of houses has something to do with the availability of houses.
Of course.
And so, it is amusing that we've had so much trouble, but now when you look back at it, you're like, it is kind of funny that it took this long to get people on board with this idea.
Yeah, in other words, that for the momentum to grow, for more people to favor more building. And I think the approach has been sort of twofold. Number one is that they believe that local governments who are deeply informed by the feedback of local residents should not have so much power to stop construction, right? That's one thing. And then another thing is that, we need to make it easier to build in the first place by having fewer just regulatory barriers to building. So there's number one, the zoning problem, and then there's number two, the fact that building anything in this country, whether housing or anything else, a factory, whatever, also requires a lot of reviews, bureaucratic obstacles, environmental hurdles, that kind of thing. And that is part of the movement that's grown. I'm kind of curious to know how you see any breakdowns within that pro-housing alliance. How does that look to you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, basically, like you said, there's historically, a commitment to local control and land use. And I like to joke that I'm so committed to local control that I believe individual landowners should have control over their land.
Their own land.
Their own land. They should have a lot of say. They should have all the say about whether it's legal, whether they should build an apartment building or, a duplex on the land that they own. The ultimate local control is devolution to the individual. One thing we raise in our kind of launch paper in 2023 for the team is we actually borrow this idea from in Catholic social thought. Actually, it's funny that it's actually when we're talking to conservatives, this could be helpful. There's this principle called subsidiarity, It's the idea that decision-making should be delegated down to the lowest level that is capable of making a good decision. I like to economize that a little bit and say delegating to the lowest level of decision-making at which all or nearly all of the costs and benefits of the decision are accrued. So you're the correct catchment area for the spillovers of a decision. So local governments that are small relative to their labor market area, so like a metropolitan area, if you just have, a city of 10,000 people in a metro area of 18 million people, any one decision you make is small relative to the entire region. And so your incentive is only to be like, well, there's nothing I can do about the region. All I can control is like traffic and the movement of people in and out of my small place. I'm just going to focus on regulating growth in my little area. And I'm not worried about what the spillover consequences to the whole region will be. But then when you have many, many, many of those, they all end up in a kind of collective action trap where no one of them can upzone enough to provide housing abundance in a high demand area. So each one of them is like, well, me alone, why should, I could upzone, but my neighborhood will never be able to do enough to solve the shortfall in this whole region. So like the regional interests are not represented in that local control. And since we don't have metropolitan governments, and there's no prospect of having them anytime soon, the idea is we need this joint partnership between state and local control, where it's basically state guardrails on local control, where they say, you're still going to have some decision-making power, but you must take into account region-wide and statewide interests in those decisions. And so that's where moving the decision-making up to the level at which those costs and benefits are internalized, that is how you solve this collective action problem.
The launch paper that you just mentioned there, that's you and your Niskanen colleagues then.
Yes.
What did it entail?
It's called The Agenda for Abundant Housing. Came out before the book. Happy to say.
Before the book, yes. Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson.
That's right. Yep.
All right, so you had the phrase first, at least when it came to housing.
Sure, right. Yeah, exactly. I trace it back to Julian Simon, the Simon versus Ehrlich bets of, way back when the population bomb 1970s stuff, Ultimate Resource by Simon. Mm-hmm. This kind of abundance thinking there's a thread of it going all the way back to the 1970s.
Yeah, what you said there was interesting. If I followed it correctly, you started by saying, well, at the smallest level, sure, you should be able to control what is on the land that you yourself own. As I understand it, though, that the problem is that people are trying to extend their control, their influence, their decision-making over the land that they don't actually own, mm-hmm. over their neighborhoods entirely, or over their streets, their blocks, whatever, that kind of thing. So when you say that it has to be a partnership between local control, like local governments that might say, we're not going to upzone any of this stuff because the people who live 2 blocks over don't like it, versus the state because now you're considering a bigger region. Does that go all the way to the national level? Like where's the cutoff and how do you decide that kind of thing?
So most of the costs and benefits are internalized at the state level. There are metro areas that are split at the state line. So it's like, New York, Cincinnati bleeds over a little bit over the border. Mm-hmm. There are places where in theory it does cross state lines. There's also like federal income taxes are progressive. And so the federal government as the residual claimant of the highest tax rates, like when people move to high wage cities, the federal government gets more tax revenue. So like in theory, there's a little bit there, but it's like, most of the benefits of growth are internalized by state governments.
There's just housing growth.
Of housing growth. There's just a little bit of there's a small fiscal externality that the federal government is the claimant of, but most of it is collected at the state level.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because it pertains to what we're going to talk about later when we get into the bill itself. What is the appropriate role for the federal government? And this bill, which we're not going to talk about in detail just yet, what it does is it tries to incentivize certain behavior at the state and local level. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of curious to know if you have a philosophical thought on what the right approach is very generally of the federal government. What kind of involvement should the federal government have versus state and local?
Definitely. It is within the federal government's constitutional power to engage in preemptive activities. It's just not in the politics. One reason my team focuses so much on we'll get to this eventually, but the HUD code chassis reform stuff is because in the 1970s, Congress and the Nixon administration decided they were going to preempt all state and local law with respect to factory-built housing installed on a permanent chassis. And so there's a single federal building code for this type of factory-built housing. And if you proposed it today, Congress would be like, whoa, that's it's one direct federal lever on housing supply and housing regulations that exists. It's a holdover from the 1970s. Certainly, if there's a broad social consensus on this, there's definitely things the federal government can do that are more direct than what is on the menu. I always say that level of what one might call intrusive federal intervention, I call it a capstone, not a shortcut to reform. Basically, by the time you get there, you need a very broad kind of supermajority consensus it's not going to be an end run around public opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I have a question about the nature of skylines and building more generally, because one of the worries that people who oppose more housing in their areas sometimes express is that, well, I didn't move here so that it would also turn into New York City, would have these enormous buildings everywhere. I quite like a lower or a medium level skyline, or I don't want the nature of where I am to change so radically. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on just the different available options for how to have more housing and more housing availability that doesn't turn your city into New York City. Because I also don't think that even people in New York would necessarily say, yeah, the whole country should look like this, right? A little bit of diversity of what the country looks like is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, part of me is I'm like, buddy, I wish, that it's like the places where if zoning did not exist, period, it was just we went back to law as it existed in 1915 in this country before the first zoning code. The areas on which it is, so why do skyscrapers exist? It is the response to land prices of builders. Like every property consists of land and structure. When land prices go up, that is a price signal to the builder to substitute more square feet of structure per square foot of land in the property that you have. Like if land is more scarce, I should substitute more glass, steel, concrete, wood for dirt because dirt is more scarce and I'm getting a price signal telling me to do that. The places where land prices are high enough to support skyscraper density, it's like 0.001% of the country's land. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like even in a free-for-all, it just wouldn't be that much of the country.
It naturally wouldn't happen.
And so the funny thing is, like, we're talking about, it's like New York City is 400 square miles and skyscrapers don't pencil on all of New York City. So it's like, nationwide, we're talking about, maybe with zero growth controls, maybe you would have a couple hundred square miles of skyscraper viable land in this country out of unlimited land. So it's very funny that it's like there's these tiny, tiny slivers of this country where skyscrapers are, or people even want skyscrapers, where people are sending signals through their purchasing behavior and their renting behavior that, I would like a skyscraper here, please. There's so few places that it's funny that it's like they won't even let us have those little slivers of this country have a little bit of skyscraper.
Yeah. Other parts of the country, I would imagine, though, if you rezone some places that only right now allow single-family homes and you just allowed even pretty small apartment complexes, mm-hmm. It wouldn't really dramatically change the skyline that much, right? You would notice it maybe, but it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Is that what you're saying? Because I actually don't know how to think about this.
Definitely. So it's like, the way to predict where this makes the most change is to look at land prices. If land prices are really high, even under single-family zoning, there are parts of Los Angeles that it's like, yep, they're spending, I don't know, what's Measure M at? Is it 80 billion, 120 billion?
I don't know.
It's a very, very expensive rail build-out that is in, some of the world's best weather, relatively high wage, high opportunity area. And land prices are really high. You're going to get big buildings next to rail stations in Los Angeles, and that's probably okay. But in most of the country, it's exactly like you said. It'll be neighborhoody and in patterns. There are places like Somerville, a small city next to Boston. It's like relatively high in population density, but it's very neighborhoody and detached in its character. And so for dyed-in-the-wool urbanists, that can be like, if you love New York City, you'll be slightly annoyed by that. You'll be like, oh, it's very neighborhoody, but most of the country are not New Yorkers. And so it's actually, it's perfect. It's like, oh, actually, yeah, you can get 13,000 people per square mile. And it still feels, it has, outside of the rail stations, it has a suburban character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And of course, your paper is called The Road to Housing Abundance. What was it?
Agenda for Abundant Housing.
The Agenda for Abundant Housing. Great. So very close. One of the aims of the more recent abundance movement, the one from Ezra and Derek, is to talk to other parts of the left. In fact, they quite explicitly say in the book, we're not really talking to conservatives here. They have their own set of goals and their agenda. We're talking to the rest of the left. We're trying to convince you that a policy agenda that leads to a really impressive, supply side, not in terms of higher or lower taxes, not Reagan supply side stuff, but just the ability to build, to create more stuff, including housing, is a good thing that complements the goals of the left. And I see within the YIMBY movement on the left, the pro-housing movement on the left, there's still a little bit of tension between, I guess, the center left, which is we got to build a lot more, and a lot of the regulations in place are needlessly obstructing that goal, versus what I guess you'd call either the further left or the progressive left, which helped create a lot of the environmental regulations in the first place and still believe it's very important. I'm just curious to know, like, how do you see that split?
Yeah, most of this is in the realm of symbolic politics. And that's also where you can get into some trouble. When you are talking about it in terms of deregulation, that becomes a totem, and it's like a word with power that has symbolic power. And people will be like, well, that's bad. And then you're like, well, do you think that apartments should be illegal next to heavy rail mass transit? And they're like, well, I mean, no, of course not. That's crazy. And you're like, well, okay. And so one way people on the
left...
So
you need deregulation to get that, right? So, like some deregulation, even you would agree with that kind of thing.
But like one way out of that also, like what AOC has tried, which I thought was very clever. I was like, whatever you got to do. She said, well, actually what we're doing is increasing regulation. Some people we're improving regulation, or like if it's a state guardrail, we're regulating local governments. And so like in far left kind of like
using the right language, but to deregulate where it's appropriate, that kind of thing.
In 80% Democrat, partially socialist jurisdictions, maybe that's what you got to do. And if that's what they got to do, look,
What's the rationale though for saying, no, we're actually increasing regulation here when what you're doing is making it easier to build something near transit? I don't understand.
Because people are rigidly ideological about symbolic words with symbolism that have symbolic power. And so like you just, and so for me, I'm kind of like,
you just say it, right?
Whatever you want to call it. It was like, right. but like to cut through the BS, what I always do is like, do you support SB 79 or not? That's the transit and jobs upzoning bill in California. You either have to vote for this bill up or down. And so like you either support that or you don't. Drop the symbolic politics. This is about, should apartments be legal next to trains or not? Whenever a conversation gets out of control, just bring it down, make it concrete, and be like, set the symbolic politics aside. Should apartments be legal next to trains? Yes, no.
The explicit connection there, by the way, is that if you build apartments closer to trains, you'll have more people using mass transit, which is itself environmentally more friendly.
Exactly.
And that's how you get past an argument that says more building generally is bad for the environment. That's what you're
It's also taxpayer protection. Federally funded mass transit. We're eventually going to get to the Build More Housing Near Transit Act part of the bill. And when I'm talking to Republicans, I'm like, this same bill, you could rename it the End Light Rail White Elephants Act. We spend a whole bunch of money on things and then ban people from using them. That's not good for taxpayers or transit riders. It's genuinely environmental. It's also genuinely protecting taxpayers.
Because if more people are using mass transit, they're paying for the fares, and that makes it easier to fund those mass transit projects. Is that right?
You're building a project that people use instead of building a train that then is forced to be empty is bad.
Yeah. You've told me before also that some of these collection action problems really matter, and that they are sometimes ignored by the pro-housing coalitions. The idea, for example, that people who oppose housing in their neighborhoods will very often advance, in bad faith, by the way, the same arguments everywhere. Like, it's going to lead to more traffic. I don't like how it's going to change the nature of the neighborhood. People can live somewhere else, that kind of thing. But that sometimes they're at least hitting on something reasonable, right? The fact that if you build more somewhere, you might actually have more traffic, right? You might end up changing a little bit the nature of the place in ways that don't make sense. I don't know. I don't want to give NIMBYs too much credit because I instinctively gravitate towards the pro-housing side, but I don't want to leave that out. I don't want to simplify it more than is justified. And in particular with the point of transportation, you've said that you can't just separate where people live from how they get around, that is an actual collective action problem where we should be listening to people who have complaints about it and how that might change. Because if not, if you keep those two things siloed, you actually are going to have some problematic building without the adjacent public services, right?
Yeah. So there's an old-fashioned a 20th century story that's supposed to explain why NIMBYism is in voters and localities' self-interest, in a kind of rationalist sense. This is associated with Bill Fischel at Dartmouth, and it's two ideas. One is fiscal zoning and the home voter hypothesis. So the idea, going to
explain those,
shorten
please.
and stylize this a little bit. Home voter hypothesis is the idea that homeowners are rational. They're like corporate shareholders who want to maximize the value of their home, and they vote on that basis. And that localities make their planning decisions, so that's the home voter hypothesis, and that affects local government through this idea called fiscal zoning. If local municipal services are provided as a club good, you don't charge tuition for public school, you charge property taxes for it. You basically charge tuition at the borders of the municipality you impose growth controls to require people to buy enough land per home that they're paying enough property taxes to cover their services. So basically, the idea is that, local governments are like little fiscal calculators who are looking at the marginal in-migrant service demand versus property tax generation and excluding low-income people that might need more intensive services. Maybe their students need an IEP or something in the local school. If they're in affordable housing, they're going to, an apartment that has less land per unit, is going to pay, lower property taxes per head. That this is the rational explanation for it. Now, there are a lot of behaviors that this explains, but there are also important breakdowns. So if single-family zoning, for example, like restricting the housing supply is what always kind of maximizes the value of a home, my favorite example is in Vancouver. There's a project called Sinnock that is a bunch of Canadian federal land right next to downtown Vancouver that the local First Nations tribe was able to basically prove through their claims process actually belonged to them. So they got this huge chunk of open land right next to downtown Vancouver.
They could do whatever they wanted with.
And they have sovereign planning permission over it. So the city of Vancouver does not have, it's sovereign land.
They can zone it however they want.
Exactly.
The city can't tell them how to zone it.
It's sovereign tribal land, so they can decide what to do. Now, if downzoning is what was profit maximizing, they would presumably just build single-family homes on it. They're not doing that. They're building an unbelievably large skyscraper development because that is ultimately what is going to maximize the value of the land. And so it's like, wait a minute, like in high demand areas, downzoning is actually bad for land values. In places like Palo Alto, if you could build a 10-story apartment building, or pick somewhere in the heart of Silicon Valley, you could bring down land costs per unit and thus average condo prices in that place substantially. You might cut them in half. But what the landowner will get from the uplift from being able to build that many more units, even though each unit is cheaper, you could do, 10 stories worth of them, you're going to do fine when it's like you'd actually, if people were just maximizing their wallets, then in high demand areas, we would actually see more, upzoning. Palo Alto would look like Sinnock if they were actually trying to maximize their wallets.
Yeah, more building, not less. Mm-hmm. In other words, sort of suggesting that people don't always know what's actually good for them when they make these decisions.
So in response to your question about traffic specifically, we hypothesize in our Agenda for Abundant Housing that maybe one of the things that has changed the political economy of housing from the local perspective over time is the transition from America being a walking and transit-based urban civilization to one that is almost completely car-based. Because when more people come to your city, cars can at best stay as good as they were when it was just you. But they are an inherently congestible technology. When more people come, it can only get worse. Mass transit is a little different because it's like a flywheel technology. People sometimes say it experiences increasing returns to scale. So when more people use it, it gets better. That means in the short term, that's like the transit agency can afford to run your bus more frequently. Instead of coming every half hour, it can come every 15 minutes or every 7 minutes if there's more riders. Beyond that, then if even more people are coming to upgrade that to a rail line. Historically in New York City, in my neighborhood in Queens, originally it was just the elevated line that had, 2 tracks and one express. As Queens kept booming, they were able to bring in a 4-track express that cut our access time from 22 minutes to 12 minutes to Midtown. So we didn't just add capacity, we actually made that extra capacity was better for already incumbent residents. So you'd be like, oh wow, growth is great. My trains are going to get better. That's how it used to work. Now it's more people just means more competition for parking. As long as we set up our transport policy in a way that more people means more cars, then people will try to ban people in order to limit cars. It's funny because I'm like a leading hater on fiscal zoning as if we just fix fiscals, if we just make growth pay.
Define fiscal zoning.
That's the one where if we can just make it so that growth always pays, instead of having to exclude people based on their expected future property taxes, which I don't think localities are actually very good at doing. When you go to a city at a zoning planning meeting and you go, oh, what's your average cost per resident versus your marginal cost per resident? And they're like, what's a marginal? And you're like, oh, so you don't know what you're doing here. That's the, where it's feels more pretextual. So if we just make growth pay, everyone will just voluntarily upzone. I'm like, well, I don't know about that. I think that it is often pretextual. There are high-profile cases of, for example, you do need a sewer system for, septic and leach field, the non-sewer way of getting water and managing waste. You need at least a 1/4 acre to do that. So you need detached single-family homes to, outside of sewer areas. But, Barnstable County very famously turned down original Clean Water Act money for a sewer because they're like, oh, by not having sewer, we'll be able to say we have an objective reason not to allow growth. And then this happens on Long Island also.
Yeah, what happened in that story, by the way?
Oh, it's unbelievable. So
tell people the conclusion of that story.
I love this one on Cape Cod. So they didn't actually stop all development. They just had a really large minimum lot size. And so they've turned their water table into poop soup, essentially. it's now like they have above levels of whatever fecal coliform or whatever the relevant bacteria is that they're now retrofitting sewers because they're like, okay, like actually we have so many septics now that it's like it's become a problem. And so they have this, instead of building a classic New England town center that has water and sewer, they have sprawl. Everything is developed. It's just on whatever 4-acre lots or something, and their water quality is bad.
And it's
like,
all gross. Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute. I thought you guys wasn't this supposed to improve your quality of life? But like now there's terrible traffic, and you have less scenic downtowns, and less you have to drive to get everywhere. It's like it's very funny that like it was done for quality of life reasons, but now it's like terrible, and they have to retrofit a sewer.
Terrific lose scenario there. Yeah. Let's turn to the Road to Housing Act now,
Great.
And in the analysis that you and your colleagues at Niskanen have forthcoming, and we'll tell everybody where they can eventually find that, you break it down into 3 main things. You break this bill down into achieving 3 main things. So first of all, why don't you just take us through what those 3 things are, and then we'll dig deep on each one. But give us that sort of top-level, superficial reading of what it does, and then we'll dive in.
Great, yeah. There's different ways to bucket this, but we like to bucket it as like there's like regulatory reform, like kind of direct regulatory reform. Another bucket is technical assistance and carrots and sticks accompanying that technical assistance. And then the third one is like funding and financing reform broadly. And then there's a whole laundry list in each one of those buckets.
Yeah, I love that. So if I were to put that in my own words, I'd say this is incentivizing local areas to build more with the carrots and sticks approach. It is then making it easier for them to build more. And then finally, it is making it a little bit easier also for more people to be able to access housing once there is more housing in the first place. Does that sound about right?
Yep.
Okay, so let's go into the first one, which I think you define as the carrots and sticks approach. What are some of the things in the bill that are incentivizing from the front, from the back, however you want to define it, local governments and localities to build more?
Great. Yeah. So like I bundled together like the technical assistance, like the informing, and then also the carrots and the sticks. So there's the Housing Supply Frameworks Act. That's one of the bills that actually, it got bundled into road, but it actually was already bipartisan and bicameral. There's already a House version of it as well.
And it got folded into this bigger bill that we're talking about now.
Exactly.
Okay, and what does that do?
And that establishes the first federal commission to develop model state and local model zoning codes. For the first time since Commerce Secretary Hoover, before he was president, had a commission that designed the State Zoning Enabling Act that then created all the states actually have the power to zone, not localities. They delegate their zoning powers to localities through this model legislation was the State Zoning Enabling Act. But it's the first revisiting of that since the 1920s.
So it's trying to get states to enforce their own better zoning rules? What exactly does it do? And what is the carrot or the stick in that case?
So this is like the technical assistance part. This one doesn't have direct carrots and sticks attached, but it's what's cool about it is it's the first time Congress ever saying like zoning is bad. It's more complicated than that. But
of course,
they basically are like there have been past things. There have been like the National Affordable Housing Act of 1990 had a commission identify barriers, but they never wrote. Congress never said what they consider housing supply barriers to be. This time they're actually writing down in great detail, like, such as, parking requirements, floor area requirements, height, lot geometry. They go through, it's a huge list of all the specific land use regulatory
helpful
controls.
References, it sounds like. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, great.
And so it's cool because this is the first time, both making it clear, what does it mean to be pro-housing? It's the first time we're ever getting congressional intent of what this means. And so that also will help, like, when HUD is doing discretionary grants and we describe them as pro-housing,
housing and urban
this is some language to be like, this
right.
is what it means parking relief, it means, height relief, things like that.
Great.
The other parts of carrots and sticks, Build More Housing Near Transit Act. That's another one that's scoring top-up for federal mass transit grants. So if you're building bus rapid transit or rail, then you get points for adopting pro-housing policies. If you let people live near it and use it, you're going to go to the top of the list. What that bill
going
does.
Back to what we were saying earlier, transportation closer to where the building's happening. Very important.
Exactly. And then another key part, and this one is my favorite for the big conceptual leap that it is. This is Senator Warren and Senator Kennedy's Build Now Act. This is carrots and sticks for the highest cost jurisdictions in the country to have a modest penalty to their community development block grant that's usable for like various types of community development, but also like infrastructure broadly. Basically, it's usable for almost anything a city likes to do except for new housing construction. But it could be like, rehab of old housing, but also infrastructure funds. What it does is it makes a pool of all the highest cost jurisdictions who have above the U.S. median in house prices and high rents. So like if you have like high house prices and high rents, you get put in this scrutiny bucket. And they get ranked by how much they've grown in the last 5 years compared to the 5 years before that. And the jurisdictions that improve the most relative to their previous behavior get put into the carrot, bucket. They get prize money. If you're below the median of the improvement rate of the scrutiny group, then you lose 10% of your community development block grant funds.
That's interesting.
It's not huge. It's not massive. But what we're doing is we're piloting the administrative plumbing and also a brand new census data set that this was my organization's key contribution to this was there's a really cool new tabulation from the census master address file. It's really cool. This is the first time it's being used, so I got another commentary on that. Hopefully,
congratulations. That's great. I want to hold on this one for just 1 second, if you don't mind.
Please.
Because it sounds like what you're saying is not that you get penalized if you just have a lot of rich people who live in your area, and it's a high-cost area. It's, are you doing anything right now to make it more possible for housing to be built so that others can move to your area, which is a big deal because, as I understand it, it is the places that have like a ton of well-off folks that traditionally it's hard to get them to move on this, right? These are people with a lot of political power, a lot of money, obviously, and they have a high incentive to resist more building, and traditionally they've succeeded. This is an attempt to apply a penalty if they continue succeeding at preventing more housing. Is that right?
Exactly. And also giving you rewards if you do better. And so it's like, because you're judged against your peers in the same time period, if there's like a recession, everyone's, permits, fall together if there's a recession type of thing, or if there's an interest rate spike or whatever's happening in the national macroeconomy is kind of implicitly controlled because you're being measured each year against your high cost peers. And it's not that you have to hit some arbitrary target. You just have to do better compared to what you were doing before, which is like not crazy to think that it's like, there's also an automatic, so if you just become cheap enough, you drop out of the scrutiny group and you're held harmless like most jurisdictions. The other things, we hold harmless most jurisdictions in the country. This is like we're targeting the, above median,
By hold really harmless, you mean they're not going to get penalized.
They get neither rewarded nor penalized. They just get their CDBG as it is. They're not
block grant.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And the other thing is if you grow 4% per year, then you're automatically in the carrot bucket if you grow that fast, if you're high cost. So if you're either above the median or if like just 4% is just objectively fast growth.
You get a little bit of federal money. Okay, great. What else is in this first bucket of incentivizing with carrots and sticks?
The last one is the innovation fund. So you can imagine this basically, it's very similar to, there's another sub-bucket of community development block grants called CDBG Pro Housing, Pathways to Removing Obstacles to Housing. That is a small discretionary grant pilot program that has existed for a couple of years. And this is like a glow up of that is outcomes oriented. So it has to actually be targeted to and paid out on the basis of actually producing units. But you can get innovation fund prizes for various types of pro-housing activities, upzoning, even some things that straddle that line in the financing world, like revolving loan funds, for example. My friend Paul Williams at Center for Public Enterprise was working on that, making sure that's included as an eligible activity. Yeah. But so various types of innovative pro-housing.
What are revolving loans funds, by the way?
That is when a local government uses, for example, the most famous example is in Montgomery County, Maryland. They issue a bond for, maybe $50 million. I think they've done more since. That then is used to provide construction loan financing at a below market rate. And so they're not losing money in dollar terms. They're just accepting a lower risk-adjusted return, even though there's yes, there is an opportunity cost. Like they could grow the fund faster if they collected a higher interest rate. But the goal there is to partially buy down rents, but also make sure that projects can pencil even if financial conditions are disorderly.
Yeah, so it sounds like what happens with this innovation fund is that you get rewarded for experimentation and results. If
Exactly.
the experimentation actually leads to more housing, then you get some money. Sounds great.
Exactly.
Not bad. Let's turn now to the next part, which is the regulatory reform part of the Road to Housing Act. What's the big one there?
Yeah. The biggest single one that I think is going to have a near-term impact is something we've been pushing for a long time, and that it's that national HUD code for manufactured housing.
HUD, you've said HUD a couple times, Housing and Urban Development.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
This is the one where if you build a home in a factory and you install it on a permanent chassis, that can, for example, be shipped across state lines, you're allowed to use the national building code. It's only the building code, not the zoning code. I'm sorry, I should also mention, most U.S. cities have at least 2 codes. The building code governs things that are supposed to be related to life safety. Sometimes they go beyond life safety, but things like, fire and soundproofing and things like that, and egress. And then the zoning code is about like height and bulk and use.
Right.
So this is not a zoning preemption. It's just a building code preemption. So wherever zoning allows these structures, you can follow the federal building code here. What's neat about that is these are some of the cheapest, naturally affordable units, like a single module HUD code home, excluding land, but including shipping costs. So like a 2-bed, 1-bath ships for about $90,000. You can look up the average sale price on Fred for the Federal Reserve Economic Database. For 2 module ones, it's like $140K or something like that. So wherever land costs are low, these are really, really cheap, market rate structures that you can do.
Yeah. Let's stick with this for a second. You're talking about homes that go through this manufacturing process that's standardized. And because of that, these homes are quite cheap. But to this point, they've been hard to actually deliver to people who want to buy them on the cheap. Because what? Just because of regulatory barriers entirely?
I was going to say, so one reason that it's impactful is because we already ship 100,000 of these a year. And it used to be more like 400,000 a year. But there's a bunch of discriminatory state and local regulations on these. Like New York State in the early 1990s banned real property titling. You're never allowed to attach it to the land like a house. You have to own it like an RV, like a mobile home. You're not allowed to turn it into literally real property, like as in realty. It has to stay personal property or chattel property. This is what property lawyers, it makes it harder to get a mortgage because you can only get an RV loan for the thing. You can't go to a bank and get a regular mortgage. Only if it's attached to the land legally can you get an ordinary mortgage. And then a lot of localities also discriminate against them. Like, say, HUD code homes are only allowed in maybe one single zone in the whole area, in part because they're naturally affordable. So the income exclusionary activities that local governments like to get up to, these homes come under attack because they're affordable.
Yeah.
And they're not subsidized. It's just they're just affordable at market rate.
Yeah. So this bill makes it easier for these homes to be deliverable. This can actually happen.
By removing the chassis, one thing is, so some local codes target the chassis specifically when they're banning this typology. So chassis-less kind of, if it's not on the chassis, then it can be installed as just like a regular
The chassis, by the way, to be clear, is the foundation, the thing that's permanent, that it has to be a part of the house, and that's what's been determined to this point to be, this is what's allowed. These other things that are more mobile, these other houses that are more mobile, not allowed. Now they might be allowed.
And it costs $5,000 per module. So $5,000 for one, $10,000 for two. And so taking $5,000 off of a product that costs $90,000 is actually a substantive kind of day one price impact. But it's also the design flexibilities. So one of the other things we've been working on the rulemaking side for a while was right at the tail end of the Biden administration, they finished something that also the Trump administration before had been working on. This is a bipartisan thing. They just legalized up to 4 HUD code units in the HUD code for the first time. So you're now allowed to have like a quadplex using HUD code modules. That means that these things can actually compete in areas that have a little more than zero land costs. Because the problem for a HUD code home traditionally when they were only single family was that in urban cores where land is $50 million an acre, if you take an acre of land and you put a $90,000 HUD code on, it's going to sell for $1,090,000 for this 2-bed, 1-bath, because the land cost is the problem. Sure. So to get in high land cost areas, it doesn't matter how cheap you get or even very low hard costs for the structure are not the binding part. You need more structure on that land to amortize those land costs over more square feet of structure. So 4plexes in the HUD code allowed to enter urban markets for the first time. Traditionally, these have always been a rural, so-called left behind. Anywhere where land prices are very low is where these were competitive. If you could do triplexes, quadplexes, if you have a big steel chassis in between the units, when you stack them, you'd have to torch a hole in them for a staircase. And It's you have this big 3-foot dead space between so the chassis relief is also going to help with that for design flexibility for this new. So it all interacts to allow these things to enter urban markets for the first time.
Amazing. That's great. Another part of the regulatory reform bucket of the bill is NEPA, environmental review. First of all, tell us what NEPA stands for and why it is such a big part of the housing conversation.
Yeah, this is the National Environmental Policy Act. I have an old Twitter joke about this, calling it the National Environment. So it's like, instead of the Environmental Policy Act of 1970, call it the Environment of 1970 Policy Act. So it's not actually about the environment. It is a process law that if you change,
it's about freezing in place everything as it was in the 1970s.
It's the environment of, including driving around the suburbs and emitting lots of carbon and qualifying air pollutants. There have been environmental law lawsuits against closing down oil derricks in Los Angeles. There was a CEQA, the state level equivalent, CEQA lawsuit against closing down oil derricks because they didn't adequately consider the cultural and historical value of the oil derricks in this neighborhood. And so it was it's not about the environment. It can be used to, if you change oil derricks, you're triggering these laws. And so it really shouldn't be called environmental review. It's just...
It should be called something more along the lines of the freeze everything in time.
Exactly.
Act, that kind of policy.
I prefer to call them...
So what is the Road to Housing Act do about NEPA environmental reviews, which I take it you're saying have been used to stop housing construction in certain parts of the country, and now they're not going to be able to? What happens?
Yeah. So the state level versions of these in the states that have them, in the 7 or so states that have them that apply to housing are a bigger deal, are more intrusive. But the federal one matters for anything that the federal government touches. So if HUD finances something through the Federal Housing Administration's multifamily financing, if they touch it through the home grant program, if they touch it through Housing Trust Fund, anything that they're touching, they're triggering this procedure law that is designed to be a new veto point, to create veto points and litigation attack surface. And it's not actually about the environment. The goal here is basically to have HUD's activities be more like ordinary, like when private entities issue a loan, they don't do these procedural reviews. Even government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie and Freddie that insure mortgages, much like the FHA at HUD, they don't do NEPA either. They do something that's very confusingly called not environmental review, but environmental site review. And that is where they investigate, they do due diligence for objective hazards to human habitation that would affect the credit quality of the building. If something is full of toxins or is in a rockfall zone or something, if the building is going to kill people or be uninhabitable, that's bad for the mortgage insurer, the GSE.
Of course.
So they still do environmental site review that's substantive. This would still have HUD do that. It's the other parts of the paperwork that deviate from that this would categorically exclude infill housing. So if you're in an urbanized area, it also excludes small projects outside of existing urbanized areas. But basically just an administrative categorical exclusion to say, you don't have to go through this extra process beyond the substantive review that you do just as a matter of due diligence.
To be clear, infill housing, as I understand the definition of it, is essentially vacant land that's not being used. And in urban areas, you'd think that land would be incredibly valuable, especially if you were to be able to build more housing on it, right? So that seems like a pretty big deal to me. Is that what you would say is the second biggest part of this bucket of the Road to Housing Act?
Oh, yeah, on the red tape side, and as it affects supply and growth controls and the regulatory imposition. There is one last part that affects, it's quantitatively large and immediate if this passes, but it affects the subsidy side of the equation.
Okay, what's that part?
And that is a bunch of Clean 8 for Section 8. Section 8 covers housing choice vouchers and project-based vouchers. This is when we give people cash that is restricted for spending only on housing. It's several million households that receive this assistance. It streamlines income certification. If you've just certified your income for another federal purpose within the last 12 months, they don't make you do the paperwork all over again. They're just okay, you're still good. You can use the one you just did. They allow landlords to pre-inspect their apartments. Section 8 was created in the 1970s.
What does that mean exactly? So as I understand it with Section 8, landlords are sometimes disincentivized from participating in it at all. The fact that they can pre-inspect apartments, what does that mean? And why does it make it easier, number one, for landlords to participate in this, and number two, for people to actually be able to access the money to use it then?
So you might remember in the 1970s when Section 8 was being created, America's problem was not, a lack of structures. The old urban crisis used to be abandonment and blight.
Right.
We built so much so fast. We actually drained city centers. Like New York City, we drained New York City not just into affordability. There were parts of New York City where, the South Bronx was abandoned.
Yeah.
Because we built so fast. We built faster than population and jobs growth in the suburbs. And it's a reminder that it's you can, when you build at the regional level faster than population and jobs growth, you can it can keep going into falling rents in many submarkets. So in the 1970s, one of their goals was housing quality. They were like, we want to give people money, but we also want to make sure that they're not going to an unrehabilitated tenement or something.
Terrible, blighted place, that kind of thing.
And so they still to this day kind of make landlords go through hell and that you have to wait for a government inspector to come and inspect the unit on your behalf. And sometimes it can be really nitpicky and can vary from inspector to inspector. So a couple things that they allow now, and so there's tons, like many public housing authorities in most housing constrained places, where there's just vacancy is so low that it's hard to find a spot for a voucher. Voucher lease-up success rates can be under 50%. Like in Los Angeles, most people who get a voucher have to go back on the waiting list because they're unable to to actually secure a home in time. And then on the landlord side, you have to keep the thing vacant, waiting the tenant to potentially move in until you get a government inspector, to show up and inspect the unit. So now they're allowing landlords to get essentially pre-qualify your structure and then get on a list at the PHA of like, oh, anyone who gets a voucher, come right to me. Like,
streamlines it significantly. Okay.
And then also remote inspections. Those were allowed on an emergency basis during COVID. But now, for the most part, people of modest means are still human beings who can make decisions in their life. And maybe they need a little bit of extra help. But having that expert on the smartphone with a camera escorting you through the inspection, that's a little help, a little parrot on your shoulder to help. But it doesn't require you to schedule someone to show up on time, the inspector to show up on time. So it's those three things together are going to have a big impact on like the effectiveness, efficiency, and paperwork burdens of several million people. Okay,
let's move on to the third category that you're using to describe the effects of the Road to Housing Act, which is financing and funding reforms. What is it doing about those?
So there's like a wide variety of things. One of them is tweaking the qualified mortgage rule and like Regulation Z in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with respect to small dollar mortgages. We cracked down on no documentation and low documentation lending after the 2009 financial crisis. And so the cost to underwrite and document a loan is much, much higher than it used to be. But we also capped fees on loan origination. So if you have a small mortgage, it costs more than it did 20 years ago to underwrite. And your fee is capped. So lenders are like, yeah, I'm small dollar mortgage.
Not going to bother.
I can't, why would I do that?
The end result of which, by the way, is that lower income folks find it a lot harder to access a mortgage, and not just because they're lower income. Because you'd think that there would be an adjustment also there for the size and the cost of the house they want to buy. Even adjusting for those things, lower income folks struggle to get a mortgage.
Exactly. So this is a thing where now I like to joke, in high cost areas, I'm like, I wish small dollar mortgages were a problem. Like I wish our mortgages were so small that it was a problem to get one. But for community development, this is important. Like if you're in Flint or if you're in the east side of Buffalo and you need an $80,000 mortgage to buy your house, like this matters for you. This is important for the community development side. They have some performance tweaks to HUD homebuyer counseling. Title I Federal Housing Administration loans. These are for manufactured homes and also for rehabs. They lift the loan limits to readjust them for inflation. They had decayed with inflation, and it allows the secretary to update them in the future with inflation. Also allows them to be used for detached ADUs.
What does all that mean?
Yeah, basically now it's easier. Manufactured home lending is going to be a little better. It'll be easier to get rehab lending through this Title I loan program. And also now you can use them for detached ADUs. So because it was a rehab loan, only attached like when you turn your garage.
Tell people what those are, by the way.
Accessory dwelling units. On the West Coast, they call them casitas. Like on the East Coast, we call them like mother-in-law units or granny flats. These are dwelling units that are accessory to the main unit.
Right. And a place where somebody could conceivably live or take shelter in for a bit. If you have a guest that comes by a lot, you could put them there, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And so these are also, they tend to be naturally affordable. They're small and like highly contextual. They fit into single family neighborhoods really well. This allows Title I to be used for not just ADUs that are like your garage, your attic or basement, but also one that's in your backyard, like a little backyard unit, something that's not attached to the main unit.
So hitting everything from all sides, basically, making it more economical to provide the mortgages, making it more economical to build these extra units, making it a little bit easier for people to access these mortgages, some counseling for them so they better understand what they're getting into when they take out a mortgage, basically everything.
Exactly.
Okay, great. What else is in this bucket, would you say?
We also have reauthorization of the home grant program. That's like a federal direct subsidy for constructing a variety. It's usable to subsidize a variety of types of housing. There's also some public housing tweaks. So there's other parts of the safety net, an expansion of something called the Moving to Work program for public housing authorities. This allows them to basically have a bunch of local it frees them from all the federal public housing rules and lets them a selection of, a couple dozen more high-performing public housing authorities have flexibility they can use those flexibilities along with the other part of this bill, raising the rental assistance demonstration cap. That's allowing to convert units from Section 9, traditional public housing, into Section 8, voucher-assisted housing. Those two together, the Turner Center, my friends at the Turner Center, shout out to Ben Metcalf, they estimate about 235,000 social housing units, like deeply affordable, subsidized units, could be built through a mixture of moving to work flexibilities and the rental assistance demonstration program. So that's pretty cool. Oh, the other part, coordinating opportunity zones with other HUD grants. This also reflected some of our interests as well.
Yeah, this is a big one. Let me pause on this one because the place where I work, the Economic Innovation Group, I think we can take the bulk of the credit for having come up with opportunity zones, and we've done a lot of research on their effects since they were first passed in 2017. And what it shows is that a lot of building that otherwise would not have happened if the law had not been passed with opportunity zones, it's led to a lot of new housing in the low-income communities where opportunity zones apply. I should, by the way, define this a little bit. Opportunity zones are effectively a capital gains tax incentive that you can get, and it's quite good if you spend money, if you're an investor and you invest your money in certain low-income communities throughout the country that are designated by the governors of the states in which those communities exist. And so, yeah, it's led to a lot of housing. So let me, having explained what that is, why don't you now give us a sense of how this bill interacts with opportunity zones?
This directs HUD to take opportunity zone designation into consideration in relevant grants. The original one was just like all grants. And I was like, well, like lead removal is probably, you should do it wherever you need the most lead removal. Not opportunity zones are great, but does that have nexus with lead or something? And so like it's with covered grants that entail like rehab, new construction. I'm sorry, there's 4 categories and I got to remember, but it's like things that are relevant to opportunity zone goals. Opportunity zones are ordered to be taken into account in grant making priority.
That's great. And what do you think would be the effect of the bill on opportunity zones and how well they work?
I think it'll be
an accelerant.
It'll be an accelerant. OZs also already appear to have a lot of juice in your diff and diff paper that it's, I mean, the effect size you guys found is so big that I'm excited to see what like so-called general equilibrium checks that you could do as well. It's like, it's going to go through peer review, but even with all that, it looks like a really, really big effect. It also should raise, I think, everyone's estimate of how important federal taxes are for projects that can pencil where you have the zoning. Unfortunately, you guys have gotten lots of bad critiques of opportunity zones. Like I feel
those critiques were quite early, though. I think before the law itself was sort of given time to take effect, before it was even sort of finalized, which took some time. The rulemaking process took some time in the years after it was passed.
I was shocked. There are reputable think tanks that put out papers on the effects of OZs before the rules were finalized.
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm like, I mean,
it makes no sense.
It's bad for your professional credibility to do that. Like that was a boo-boo. But it even goes beyond that. So like with respect to, so opportunity zones are supposed to be, what's neat about them is that they're supposed to be places that need place-based assistance. But it's not like the subsidy is unlimited, right? It's just a relief of capital gains tax on the structure, not even the land uplift, just the structure, which is cool. That means that like places that are close to opportunity, but not quite at the cusp, are places where it's like, rents would have had to risen more to hit the hurdle rate of return for a project to be investable. With the capital gains tax relief, the break-even market rent for them to pencil is lower than it would be if they had to also pay the operating cost plus the capital gains tax. And so, because otherwise you'd be like, well, if you're zoning constraint, like OZs can't help Manhattan much because tons of lots are already, until we do, unless we did upzoning first, a lot of places are already built above what the current zoning code allows in Manhattan. So it's places like next to. So it would be like in a spot where there's zone capacity, but rents haven't yet hit that level where construction is feasible yet. That is where we're seeing these huge numbers in your study.
Yeah. By the way, I asked about this not just because it's our EIG's thing, but it also relates to that question earlier we had about the appropriate role of the federal government and what this bill effectively represents the federal government should be doing. The other idea, by the way, that we at EIG have been working on, still very preliminary, is something that we're tentatively calling density zones at the moment. And this is the idea that the federal government could work on one standardized zoning code that then certain localities could voluntarily opt into. And if they do, and then if they hit certain performance metrics of building, then they would qualify for federal money. And I'm curious, number one, to know how you think an idea like that would interact with the Road to Housing Act itself, but also what you think about the idea.
One of my favorite things about it is, so your colleague Adam Ozimek and my friend and my co-author, Chris Elmendorf at UC Davis, the three of us have for years been together on Twitter talking about, boy, would we love to have, I think I call them reverse impact fees, but maybe we need a better word than that. But like basically that it's like, cities charge impact fees to new development to cover the fixed costs of new infrastructure and things. If the federal government just gives you $10,000 or $20,000 per permit, that can displace, it can fund services in the same flexible way that impact fees do, but without having to actually charge them to the new housing and, have that bake into construction costs. And so I think that's a really cool thing. Like the only concerns I've heard are like the marketing, that it's like, oh, some people might not like the word density in density zones or something. There's all I'm not a marketing guy. I'm a policy guy. Don't ask me.
We like the name, but we're trying to figure it out because sometimes people associate the word density with a certain like partisan or ideological approach to things.
Right.
And we're also trying to avoid that thing I said earlier where people assume that if you want more density or more building, that it necessarily means you're trying to turn every town into New York City, into something that looks like New York. We're actually trying to design this thing so that there's some flexibility in the kind of new building that makes sense for a particular locale,
which
I think is important.
So a year ago, what I would have said is my main problem is that it's too ambitious. I was like, we can't even get Congress to do the YIMBY Act. We can't get them to do Housing Supply Frameworks Act. That's the so YIMBY Act
like
is
some
the one,
smaller act,
exactly.
right?
YIMBY Act is actually the one of we've got everything in this bill. The YIMBY Act is the one piece that's not actually in this.
In the Road to Housing Act, you mean? Okay.
But
and what's missing then? What is it?
The YIMBY Act is just a reporting bill. I'm surprised that it become as controversial on the Hill as it is.
This is really funny. So this much smaller bill that you were using as an example of what Congress can't even get done to say density zones are too ambitious. Now the Road to Housing Act comes out and you're like, oh my God, right. Ambition is back.
Exactly. Ambition is back. And so I would have said before, I was like, until we can get something like the Road to Housing, I don't think Congress is ready to talk about something like density zones. And now it's like, oh, well.
Yeah, why not?
Hey,
sure.
It's like I said, my concern was an if then, and if we send it right the if, then we get to the then, right?
Yeah, I'm excited for people to read the upcoming report that you and your colleagues are putting out on the Road to Housing Act. And again, we're going to share the link to it in the show notes. Of course, it's going to be at the Niskanen Center website, I take it. That's where it's going to be. It's going to be published. But you were kind enough to share an early version. I actually want to quote to you this one passage of it and just get your sort of take on it, because I think it reflects your optimism about the bill. So here's what you write. The Road to Housing Act is the first comprehensive bid to tackle the roots of America's affordability crisis in a generation. It correctly identifies and takes initial steps to attack the interlocking barriers to housing abundance at every level. And this is my favorite part. This is the part that comes next, where you write, it is miraculously bipartisan, and its negotiation and development exhibited a stunning, almost anachronistic return to the old Senate tradition of depolarized collegiality and bipartisan problem solving. That's the end of the quote. That's quite uplifting. It also seems to run contrary to the spirit of the moment, if you ask me. Like it's a strange thing to believe about something that's happening right now, given the tumult and the rancor that exists in politics at the moment. What do you think?
Yeah, it's like, I mean, in some ways, our country has never felt more like divided and polarized and like, madness and unprecedented times. And then all of a sudden, Senate banking is like legislating like it's 1999. Like it's just like, oh my God, like Senator Warren and Senator Scott are chuckling,
ideological opposites, by the way, but now getting along to do this.
Yeah, the chairman and the ranking member clearly have developed a good working relationship and a lot of trust. All of a sudden, you just are hearing this kind of Cronkite, like, let us reach across the aisle and solve a problem for the American people. And you're like, whoa, I mean, okay. But I mean, I also joke that it's like, it's been more like Schoolhouse Rock than like House of Cards, in its version of DC. That it's like, just people were like, let's get to yes. And just like lots of good faith negotiating and sometimes there are things like hostile leaks of an incomplete draft of something that makes something look bad, that, just everyone was working together, like in genuine good faith. And so there were reporters asking after the markup, the press gaggle outside, they were like, after everything that's happened to HUD, HUD almost got gutted. We also, again, Congress also helped a little bit. We were back-channeling a little bit on that, on the depth of the DOGE cuts. In March, people weren't sure if HUD was going to exist. And in July, Senate Banking is doing a bipartisan housing package. Like, how is this possible? And yeah, it just, I think that like the mixture of the structural incentives plus like what people were hearing in town meetings, everyone's hearing about housing. All the members are hearing about it. And I don't know, what were your impressions?
No, I mean, reading your piece and having spoken to you about it before our chat today, I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I knew something weird was happening when I saw your first tweet about it, where you tweeted after you'd finished reading it, oh my God, this thing rules.
Yeah.
Something like that. So I knew something was different. But then what I expected after I saw that was for it to get a ton of coverage. Oh my God, bipartisan bill to solve like the one economic problem that everybody agrees is an actual problem that everybody wants to be fixed. And there were some people who wrote it up, but it just didn't get anything like the breadth of coverage that I would have expected. And again, I think that probably says something about the wider circumstances in Washington at the moment. There's also a sense in which I wondered if so much attention is being drawn to other things, geopolitics, I don't know, tariffs, the tax on the Fed, whatever, that maybe there was a kind of useful space for this to slip in under the radar, this super ambitious thing to slip in under the radar. That's what my reaction was.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's true. Like, I was really impressed with the members in the markup with their framing, where they both like recognized what this is and they didn't resort to hyperbole, because it's like Senate Banking hasn't done any housing markup in almost 20 years, let alone something significant like this. It's tempting then to be like, oh my God, like we solved it, it's over. What everyone was saying was this is an essential and significant first step into solving the crisis. Even Chairman Scott said, how about first leap? Can we say first leap? So like that's the people are like, is this the first step or the first leap? Because it's like I'm with Chairman Scott. I'm like, yeah, I would call this a first leap.
Sure.
But so like everyone was always recognizing its seriousness and significance and like being like, this is going to help millions of people. It's not a small deal. It's also not like this alone ends the crisis. Like ongoing state and local action, like there's tons of the flurry of activity at the state level is still absolutely essential. This is backstopping, supporting all that state action.
That's great. That is our chat on the Road to Housing Act. That was a lot of fun and super informative. And I want to close with a little bit of a personal conversation. You and I are both New York residents, New York City residents. How long have you been here, by the way?
Since 2013 with a break for grad school.
Okay, so 12 years. All right. I'm a little bit older than you are. I've been here for 22 of the last 23 years. Okay. And you tweeted something kind of interesting about life here in NYC. And I wasn't exactly sure what you meant, so I wanted to ask you about it and have a little quick chat about it to close. You wrote the following: I live in NYC in part because it indulges the pleasant delusion that high classical liberal urbanism, which was the period between 1880 and 1940, did not lose the battle of the 20th century. What do you mean by that? What does that mean?
There is basically there is a way of life that was typical in every American city in the pre-war era that can only be obtained now in basically think of like zip codes that have more than 10,000 people per square mile. It's very, very small numbers of areas. It's like New York City plus like Boston core, Chicago core, SF core, one tiny part of like Koreatown in Los Angeles, like a little bit of Seattle. There's just not a lot of places where you have this kind of like lively retail and small business scene, full sidewalks, places where it's like when people are like, you walk to the grocery store? That's like witchcraft. That's like people like, what do you mean you walk to the grocery? That's impossible. You cannot do that. You can't walk to the grocery store. That was a thing. Like every American city used to be, downtown Buffalo used to look like Soho in Manhattan. The pictures,
the walkability.
If I showed you a picture of downtown Buffalo and a picture of Soho in both of them in 1915, like a layperson would not be able to tell the difference. They'd be like, I don't know, it looks the same to me.
But you're talking specifically about the wide sidewalks, the walkability, the fact that you could walk outside your door.
The transit to retail, the life, the liveliness, like the idea that, all our downtowns our little downtowns are all dead type of thing. Like our, retail is vacant. Like the idea of walking, why would I want to walk somewhere? Like in most of America, when you walk somewhere, someone will stop and be like, are you okay? Like this walking environment is so unpleasant. You must have had a car breakdown, or maybe you had a DUI and you're not able to drive or something. Like, there's lots of parts of the country where if you're walking, like people will just stop to offer help because they'll assume, like, why would anyone walk here? It's so miserable. You must not be doing it by choice. And so like that's a type of living that in the era from kind of the invention of the electric streetcar all the way up to like the golden age of, rail rapid transit, it's like first the Depression and then wartime steel rationing and then automobility after World War II. skyscrapers got banned and we forgot how to build subways. But when you're in New York or downtown Chicago in the Loop, you can kind of pretend like, yeah, this country, we can still build skyscrapers and trains. Like I've jokingly called it like a Shutter Island for urbanists, where we almost can delude ourselves that we can still do this.
Spoiler alert, by the way, if people didn't see the 2000 and something Martin Scorsese film. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Something about living in New York that relates to the conversation we've just had about building came to mind, because I've been reflecting, not just in the last few months, really the last couple of years, about something that's been a little bit disappointing. And I consider New York home. I really like it. I have great networks of friends and professional networks and all that stuff here. But the truth is, when I first started living here, I actually did think it would change more. I thought I would notice the change more. And the truth is, when people talk about change in New York, they usually mean one of two things. Either that it's a transient city. A lot of people move here for professional reasons, especially early in life, 20s, early 30s, and they leave if they want to start families. Or they're talking about the fact that there was some turnover, they're on their local restaurant, which was their favorite place, shut down, and then some other restaurant took its place. Or in some cases, it's fairly positive change, like some rundown place became a nice urban coffee shop or something like that, whatever. But actually, I've kind of noticed that the New York City physical environment has not changed that much in the roughly almost quarter century that I've been here. I'm wondering if you noticed the same thing or if you've just had a different experience of it.
I'm of two minds. You are statistically correct. I actually think sometimes one of the problems we have in New York is that people see highly visible change and think that everything is changing when actually very little is. Like Hudson Yards, like if you're walking anywhere in Brooklyn and Queens, there are a bunch of avenues that look onto the Empire State Building. And on 34th Street, Hudson Yards has super talls that are right now on the shoulder. They just rise over the shoulder of the Empire State Building. In 2013, they just weren't there. And so those are the 57th Street super talls. And then the Brooklyn Queens waterfront, so Long Island City, Greenpoint, and Williamsburg, they're statistically very small parts of the city, but they're all like, when you're walking along the waterfront parks, they're super, super visible. And also, the nature of a 1,400-foot super tall is you can see it from very far away. It's like, oh my God, like there's cranes everywhere. Oh my God. It's just like, but there's actually not cranes everywhere. It's just, right. You could see them from very many miles away. And so I think that certain high visibility changes are there, but it's like Long Island City and the Brooklyn Queens waterfront have changed on the scale of Nashville visually, but they are so much smaller relative to the 20 million person labor market area of New York that it has tricked some people into thinking we're building a lot when we're actually building at Detroit rates in New York City.
Yeah. Are you more or less optimistic now about housing generally, either in New York or throughout the country, given the existence of this bill, which may or may not become law? We want to be clear. We don't know. We haven't commented on that. And I personally have zero idea what its chances are. I think the fact that it has gotten this far is very impressive. I think the fact that it exists is borderline shocking. So I'm a little more optimistic. I'm wondering where you are.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, so big chunks of this already have bipartisan co-sponsors in the House, like Housing Supply Frameworks Act, Build More Housing Near Transit. Those are already bipartisan bicameral bills that are wrapped up in this.
The little parts of the overall Road to Housing Act, you mean, have some support in the House then. So in the Senate, obviously, it has bipartisan support.
Exactly. Okay. So some of these already have House support. There's other stuff that's new that we'll have to check. Spending in this environment is always fragile. So like the Innovation Fund, what will the House do with the $200 million? I mean, $200 million isn't a bank breaker, but it's, things have been tight, on the fiscal side. So, we'll see for various subcomponents, but I am optimistic that something's going to happen here. And, yeah, I would say, like, for housing broadly, my friends at the Niskanen Center have a new roundup out now on hundreds of pro-housing reforms at the state and local level, like an all-time record. So, like, at the state level and now also at the national level, it's like we are finally getting to kind of escape velocity on this stuff. I'm a little worried about California because it was, had a, strong early start, and like some of their legislature dynamics are starting to, we'll see what, happens. Like their huge legislative champions are going to start running into term limits at some point. So we got to keep an eye on California. And I really want to see SB 79 pass over there before they lose their, window. But in the rest of the country, we are still just on the steep part of the S curve.
Yeah. Last question. You're going to be a New Yorker for life, you think? You're going to become like an old guy like me still in New York?
That is my preference. I mean, I would do a tour of duty in government in D.C., but I don't see myself. I mean, I used to joke that I wanted to be like a rent-stabilized deli guy who, like lived above the diner and it goes down with my elderly friends reading the daily news going like, oh my God, can you see what the mayor did this time? Like, that's the, just,
that's the dream.
That's the, I know I'm in a co-op, but that's still, the people always ask me, you must hate D.C., or something. And I'm like, no, actually, D.C. is a perfectly nice place to live. There are many nice neighborhoods. I'm not anti-D.C. I'm just pro-New York.
Pro-New York, yeah. You and me both, pal. Both working, by the way, for D.C.-based think tanks, but there you go. Alex, thanks so much. This has been such a fun, deeply, richly informative chat, and I know our listeners are going to love it.
Thank you for making time. It was great.
And that's our show for today. You can find links to the work done by Alex and his colleagues at Niskanen in the show notes for this episode, and definitely be on the lookout for their upcoming analysis of the Road to Housing Act. The New Bazaar is a production of the Economic Innovation Group. Adrian Lilly is our sound engineer, and our music is by Scott Lane and DJ Harrison of Subfloor Studio. Special thanks to Ruben Francis and Stephen Leverton for production assistance. Please follow or subscribe to the News Bazaar on your app of choice, and if you enjoyed today's show, leave us a review or tell a friend. It really is the best way for people to find out about us. If you want to get in touch, I'm on Twitter, or X, as @Cardiff Garcia, or you can email us at thenewbazaar@eig.org. And we'll see you next episode.